On this edition of Independent Sources, Sanctuary Cities. What powers do these municipalities really have in their effort to combat President Donald Trump's aggressive deportation policies?
Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Your host this week, Zyphus Lebrun.
Sanctuary cities are under fire from President Donald Trump, who has threatened to withdraw federal grant money from these municipalities that resist the government's efforts to deport undocumented immigrants. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, Director Sara Saldana testified to Congress in 2015 that more than 200 jurisdictions did not honor ICE requests to detain individuals, while the Center for Immigration Studies, a think tank that promotes restricting immigration, reported that more than 17,000 detention requests were rejected between January 1, 2014 and September 30, 2015. In light of this mounting pressure and reports of increasingly defiant leaders in these cities, we wanted to talk about the powers that these municipalities really have to protect their undocumented residents. With me in studio are Abraham Palos, the Executive Director of the human rights organization Families for Freedom, and Alan Wernick, the Director of the CUNY Citizenship Now program. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so sanctuary cities. There's a lot of talk about them now, and they've come under some fire from President Donald Trump. Alan, I'll start with you. Why does, sanctuary cities have been around for a while. Why now does there seem to be a real conflict there with the president?
Well, I think that what's happened is that the new president has substantially increased the threat to the immigrant community. He's talking about arresting a much broader sector of the community. Under President Obama, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, there was a little bit of discretion given to the Immigration Service to allow people to stay here if they didn't have a criminal record. So I think the community is very concerned, and so the individuals, cities who care about their immigrant communities are standing up, the leadership in those cities, speaking out. So a conflict is developing, a conflict between what the president and his colleagues want and what the community thinks it deserves and wants, and the leadership in communities where the immigrants have particular influence, like a city like New York, like a city like Los Angeles, a city like San Francisco, where immigrants are a particularly important part of the populace.
Mm-hmm. Now, Abraham, your organization works with a lot of people who are immigrants, a lot of immigrants.
Yeah, mostly all.
Right?
Yeah, mostly.
So what's the sense of from these people now? Are they concerned about their well-being? I mean, has it gone from 0 to 60, if you will?
Right. I mean, I think Alan also made a great point, particularly around the conflict. I think there's also a conflict between what is actually happening on the ground and what the politicians are really saying, particularly around sanctuary cities. Our community, our population, it's basically those that have had contact with the criminal system. As far as the fear goes, is there an increased fear, an increased panic? I mean, it's been basically the same. Those that have had contact with the criminal system that are foreign-born or non-citizens have always been under threat, have always been basically an onslaught in the community, particularly with the home raids in New York that have increased since March 2015. So going to your question about has there been an increased panic, I think overall that there has, but for the great majority of New Yorkers that have been getting deported, this is essentially business per usual. Mm-hmm. There were 41 that were picked up, particularly in the most recent raids, but also last August there were 50, I believe around 50 that got picked up in the same manner. And so what we're really seeing is that there's a lot more attention being put onto that, and we appreciate that attention, mm-hmm. but also we want to sort of clear the air around these issues around sanctuary city and is New York. There's, ever since the detainer bill in November of 2014 that dropped in city council, mm-hmm. ICE has been increasing home raids in New York City, and unfortunately the mayor's office and the city council do not publicly recognize or acknowledge those home raids that have been happening because it's people that have had contact with the criminal system.
Okay, now I want to dovetail from what you've just said and go to a clip of Melissa Mark Viverito, the city council speaker, during her recent State of the City address.
Yeah, let's do that, yeah.
First, we will not waste city resources to help immigration authorities locate otherwise law-abiding New Yorkers who pose no threat to public safety. We will not be a pawn in that game. Next, the Council will pass legislation blocking ICE from private areas on city property and offices where New Yorkers receive social services. Unless they have a judicial warrant or court order. And we will not allow officers of the Department of Probation, the NYPD, and the Department of Correction to act as ICE agents and enforce immigration law. They have better things to do.
Now, Abraham, that from Melissa Mark Viverito, and what you just said as regards to the city kind of publicly acknowledging that, is that not a bit of a public acknowledgement of what's happening in the city, in your mind?
I mean, I don't know what that was, really. I mean, I think, so first of all, I mean, she says law-abiding, and I think that that's really problematic, particularly in Black and brown communities. And in New York, 1 in 3 New Yorkers are foreign-born. 1 in 9 New Yorkers have been convicted of a crime or have gone through the criminal system in the last sort of 10 years, according to stats in 2014. So I can get to the law-abiding part in a second, but 2 things I want to address. One, about her saying that they do not allow, or they're blocking ICE, which is like this offense, where New Yorkers are getting social services. Now, it has been documented, well documented, that ICE agents have been in the courts. Right? And so that's a place in which I would argue that New Yorkers are getting services, right, to either fight their cases, beat a ticket, or what have you. And so that brings in a level of fear and panic that I think the city isn't really understanding that ICE is already there. The second point I wanted to make around this issue around parole and the probation officers, yes, they do not enforce immigration laws, but they do work with immigration authorities. So much so that a lot of folks that are on probation or on parole do get picked up because of that information sharing. So it's one thing to say, yeah, parole officers aren't enforcing immigration laws, right. But it's another thing to sort of say they're not working together, which is an alternative fact. Like that's not true. They are working together.
Now, one of the things that you and I, Abraham, have talked about on this show and have come up is this whole issue of secure communities. And secure communities for, the audience is essentially where the government shares information, the local authorities share information with the federal government. Now, Alan, in light of secure communities and in light of President Trump's efforts to, I suppose, reinvigorate that program, can cities like New York truly say, hey, listen, we will not cooperate? Will they risk, can our cities at risk for saying, hey, listen, we won't cooperate?
I don't think they are, and I would say that whatever limitations there might be on cities that call themselves sanctuary cities, I think it's a substantial, an important fact that cities not participate in secure communities. And what that means in practice is that, of course, the secure community information, what it does is it takes local police information and sends it to a national database that would include people with immigration violations or have outstanding deportation orders, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. But what those who refuse to participate and resist that program, what they won't do, as New York City says it won't do, is detain individuals at the request of the Immigration Service, of ICE. ICE can make that request in 2 ways. One, they can just simply call and say, please hold this person, or they can have what they call an administrative warrant, administrative hold, a more formal hold. And I think it's a substantial benefit to the immigrant community for the for the local NYPD, the probation authorities, for the Department of Corrections, not to detain those people, because in other cities they do. Mm-hmm. And so, in terms of what impact that can have on federal funding, which the president has said that he is going to try and impact federal funding, I'm not sure he can do that. Certainly under current law, I don't think he can do that. Whether he can do that by having Congress pass a law that could change that's possible. It's unclear to me, but it's possible. One thing to remember, though, is it's going to require 60 votes in the Senate to pass any new immigration legislation. And I'm confident that there, between now and whenever that legislation comes forward, that there'll be a few Republicans that can be pulled away from the administration. There'll be, hopefully the Democrats will stand solid. So, and Charles Schumer, who is the minority leader in the Senate, he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people. Of course, we lost Ted Kennedy, who was our champion in the Senate, but I'm confident that, I'm hopeful and confident that Charles Schumer can rise to the occasion. He certainly knows the issue, has been involved with it for a long time. So we'll see. But I think that, I just want to say that I do think it's a substantial benefit.
Right.
It's not everything. As was pointed out, look, we call ourselves a sanctuary city, but still 41 people were picked up. So no city is going to be able to completely deter ICE activity. But I think that it can be resisted, and let's hope that the city continues to resist it as well as it can.
Okay, we'll have to stick a pin. We're due for our first break. We'll have more with my guest right after this. Thanks for staying tuned to our conversation about sanctuary cities. With me in studio are Abraham Paulos and Alan Wernick. All right, so as we went to break, we were talking about, resisting and so forth, Abraham. And one of the things that I kind of want to go back to is this whole notion of reconciling secure communities with this notion of sanctuary cities. All right? I want to ask you, is there like you feel like there's a middle ground where, the city can, on one level, hand over people who may have been charged with violent crimes or extreme crimes, and then protect others who haven't committed a terrible crime. For instance, if you have a ticket or something and you end up,
right?
Is there a middle ground, do you think?
So, are there degrees?
Yes.
Right? Personally, I just think that it's a slippery slope.
Right.
Once we never want to trust the criminal legal system, ever. Okay, we're looking at a system in which 92 to 97% nationwide, but in the city it's around 98%, plead guilty to a felony before even taking it to trial. So what the city's asking, right, the community to do, particularly in poor Black and brown communities, in which we're overly targeted by the police, by the NYPD as it is, and then get thrown into a court system in which just hands out felonies like hotcakes. Right? And so then asking the community to sort of say, well, we're going to trust this institution to say who's a threat to public safety, right? And so what you're seeing in the criminal justice reform movement or what have you are people seriously questioning and having real conversations by saying, this institution, these courts, do we really want to trust them and to say who's a threat to public safety, who is violent, who is an offender, or what have you. So what I would say is that I think we need to push back, particularly with the movement that is already there, by saying we cannot trust this institution to sort of say who's keeping our community safe or not.
But
go ahead.
I'm sorry, but doesn't everything fall apart if there's not a system to kind of trust there, Abraham? Don't you think?
Well, I actually no, because listen, so even in the criminal legal system, even in the court system, right, no matter what, no one will ever get sentenced to deportation as a consequence to a crime, right? The judge might give you 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, give you life in prison.
Right.
And in fact, you can even get the death penalty before you can get a consequence for a crime that says it's deportation. So what I would argue is that I would actually agree with the judicial branch and the Constitution of the United States of America that basically says, hey, these are two different things, right? So sort of saying that this is a consequence for a crime, it's never really ever happened. No one's ever been, sort of sentenced to deportation for the consequence of a crime. And I think we need to again, that's a slippery slope that I was talking about.
But this whole process of deporting the estimated 11 million people who are here undocumented, that's going to be costly, though, isn't it?
I'd say impossible. I think the plan of the Trump administration is to create fear in the immigrant community, to discourage people from coming to the United States who may have, prior to the administration coming, thinking that maybe they would come and either unlawfully or come legally and then overstay. I think the notion that people are going to start leaving because they're going to be so scared is wrong, because people are just going to be driven underground and people have really nothing to go back home to most of the
Right.
people who are here undocumented. So it's pretty unrealistic. I think it's a lot of hot air, but it is creating a tremendous amount of fear.
Right.
And I think one of the things that advocates need to do is to try and put it into perspective, which I think hopefully we're trying to do, we're helping to do with this program, and to get people to understand that things are not, at least as of today, as we're talking about it, things are no worse than they were, let's say, in 2011, 2012 under the Obama administration. They could get worse. I think that there's some situations where, for instance, let's say there's an arrest of a person who has been convicted of a felony, ordered deported, and has failed to depart. There may be other people in the household who are picked up at the same time. Those people are likely to face deportation, where perhaps under Obama's administration they would not. But that's really a relatively small number. In terms of the large number of undocumented people, and by the way, I question the number of 11 million. I think it may be substantially less than that, but
Right.
Whatever the number is, there's a lot of undocumented people here. And I think that there's two reasons why. First of all, it's very physically impossible. The amount of money and resources have to go in. Immigration courts are backed up 5 years already.
Right.
And I think structurally, in terms of the United States economy, it's not really possible. I mean, do we really want to only drink wines from France, or we still want to drink wines from California? You know, do we want to only eat tomatoes from Holland, or do we want to eat tomatoes that are grown in the United States? So it's interesting that the three industries where you find large numbers of undocumented people, hospitality, agribusiness, and construction, two of those three businesses the Trump administration has a lot of experience with, construction and hospitality. They own a winery too, but I'm not sure that that's such a big part of their activity. So, and I think that it's unrealistic to think that this economy can continue to survive and grow with the kind of deportation plan that Trump is talking about. And if you look what's happened with the Deferred Action Program, that's a program for childhood arrivals. People came here before the age of 16. Trump said on the first day in office he was going to eliminate the program. Now it's more than a month later, and the program is still in place, and I hope that it stays in place for a great while. The reason for that is because these are people who are integrated into our community.
Yeah.
They're college students, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're teachers. It's not so easy. There's 750,000 people with deferred action for childhood arrivals. Let's say 550, 600,000 of them are employed. Imagine trying to take those people out of the workforce overnight. I think that's a tough call for the president. So we'll see. And the other thing last thing I would say is, I've been doing this for too many years. This is the largest response to any immigration restriction that I've ever seen since I've been involved in this issue, which is a lot of years. It's overwhelming what is going on. The calls I'm getting from private lawyers who want to volunteer their time, the outpouring in the streets, the demonstrations, the people that went to the thousands of people that went to the airport when the Muslim ban went into place. So I think that this popular response is going to have an impact as well. It cannot be ignored. It cannot be ignored by the executive branch, the president. It cannot be ignored by the courts.
Right. To Abraham Tahuyu, one of the things that the speaker also mentioned in her speech was this whole notion of reaching out to community organizations, providing funding, providing some sort of legal assistance. Do you see that forthcoming? Have you been in contact with her office and other
No
city
contact
offices?
with her office. But I mean, I think that they're going to go for community organizations that fall in line with their political sort of ideology or the rhetoric, basically. And so when she goes out there and says like law-abiding New Yorkers, I mean, I think that, again, it's a disconnect from what's really happening in poor Black and brown communities in New York City, sort of saying we're only going to help those that have had no contact with the criminal system, right? And you're looking at New York, the New York Police Department, has been dubbed as the 7th largest army in the country or what have you, or in the world. And so I just really think that you can't have one without the other, right? You can't have this sort of increase in law enforcement in our communities while we've known crime has gone down since the 80s, but yet the budget for the police has increased. And so what I would say is that this money that they're going to give out to the community organizations or these resources, I think that's all well and good, but what we're really talking about is a situation in which our communities continue to get criminalized while they're making these claims.
Right. I know that Rory Lankman, I believe the chairman of the City Council, Council Courts and Legal Services Committee basically said that broken windows was the fuel for Donald Trump's deportation machine. That's a quote from him. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at, the conversation I was trying to...
I mean, broken windows is a fuel for the court system, for the prison system, and for the deportation system, right? So broken windows just does not affect... It isn't bad because it leads to deportation. I mean, broken windows is bad because it's horrible, but it's a police policy. Right, and so, and this is where we came from stop and frisk, and now we're in broken windows, and I'm sure they'll come up with something cute later, right? What I'm trying to advocate for is that what we're really talking about is about less police and more schools, right? Less police and more foods for our community, housing. Like, these are things that are really going to keep our community safe, as opposed to sort of saying that, all right, well, the NYPD is going to split from Immigration Customs Enforcement. They're pretty much one force as it is.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, let's stick a pin there. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with a few final thoughts from our guest. Welcome back. Alan, before we went to break, we were talking about secure communities and so forth. And the City Council Speaker also mentioned the fact that New York was in the process of creating a system where, for instance, open carry of a container, of an alcoholic container, may not be a felony. It may be something of an infraction, so that persons who are charged for this will not necessarily enter the system, right? How far do you think that can go in keeping people out of the system in an effort to avoid just kind of falling into the criminal system?
Well, first, I want to emphasize again that I don't anticipate a large increase in the numbers of people who are going to be arrested, detained, and deported over the next, at least short period of time, next 1 or 2 years. That said, I think anything that's done to lessen the criminal record of an individual, because it's not just a question of people who are undocumented, it's also, for instance, people who want to become U.S. citizens. Right. That can affect the right. You become a U.S. citizen, you might be able to file for your brother, sister, parent, or spouse, or your children. So at CUNY Citizenship Now, our view is we do everything we can to get people on the path to citizenship, whether they're undocumented or permanent residents. We want to take them one step forward. At every step in that process, there are barriers that our law places to getting to the next step because of certain criminal offenses. And some of them are relatively minor. Right. In fact, it's interesting that, we talk about aggravated felonies, which are considered a very serious crime under immigration law. Some of those are actually misdemeanors, but under immigration law, they're defined as felonies, as aggravated felonies. So I think it's an admirable effort. Anything we can do to lessen the number of people who are arrested, detained, charged, fined, or imprisoned for criminal activity is certainly going to be a benefit to the immigrant community, especially for those minor offenses.
Right. Now, I joke sometimes. I'm an immigrant to this country, full disclosure. And I joke sometimes that, hey, listen, I don't want to get arrested or ticketed for jaywalking, because that could lead, if I do apply for my citizenship, that can mean, hey, listen, there's something on your record. I mean, does it get as granular as that, Alan?
Well, you're not going to be denied citizenship for jaywalking. You're not going to be denied citizenship for parking tickets. You're not going to be denied citizenship for most vehicle traffic violations. But you're going to have to present depending on what you're convicted of. For instance, if you're convicted of disorderly conduct because you had an open container of beer in the street, you're going to have to bring those records with you. If you have too many of those convictions, it's possible that you're not going to be deported, but it's possible your citizenship could be delayed. So certainly it would behoove anyone who is not a U.S. citizen to be extraordinarily careful to not break our laws. But let's not exaggerate it either.
Right. And that's kind of coming back full circle, because you mentioned something in the second block of this segment where you talked about President Obama and policies under him as regards to deportations. And you basically said, essentially nothing's changed. But
So far, nothing's changed. I would say that's pretty much accurate. If you look at the policies and practices, very little has changed as of this moment, and I don't anticipate there'll be a tremendous amount of change because the resources simply aren't there. And there's also legal challenges. And one thing, for instance, that the Trump administration has talked about changing, but we haven't seen implemented yet, is something called expedited removal. Right. Under a 1996 law signed by President Bill Clinton, a person who's been in the United States for less than 2 years can be deported without a hearing. That's of questionable constitutionality. It hasn't really been tested because there haven't been a large number of cases. Up until now, it was only applied to people who've been in the United States 14 days or less, people within 100 miles of the border. So there hasn't been widespread attempts to implement it. If there is, you can expect substantial legal challenges. In my opinion, it's unlikely to meet the test of the constitutional test of the right to due process, which has gone back to the 19th century, right, when the courts first started looking at these immigration issues. So there may be some attempts, but again, wanting to deport large numbers of people and being able to do that, I expect more brutality. I expect more evilness. There are immigration ICE agents who are just chomping at the bit to do the wrong thing.
Right.
But in terms of the overall numbers of people and the types of people, I don't expect a dramatic change. Under the Obama administration, it wasn't just criminals that the Obama administration went after. It also went after people they called abscondees, which are people that maybe came in on a visitor's visa, overstayed, found themselves in deportation proceedings, ordered deported, and then didn't leave. So that person would be a priority under the Obama administration. That person is a priority also under the Trump administration. So the only people, as I mentioned before, the only people that I can see in the short term are ending up in trouble are people that are hanging with people who are one of the target categories, right, and they get swept up in the situation.
The dragnet picks them up too. Anything to add, Abraham?
Well, I want to make a point. Alan makes a great point by saying the laws haven't changed. It was 1996 under the Clinton administration in which the two laws that IRA, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, and the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act, that were passed, right? So laws haven't changed. What we're seeing is sort of a difference in opinion of who they're going to pick up today and who they're going to pick up tomorrow. I also want to make a note that, after the 1996 laws had changed, almost every president, right, since then has deported more people than any other president before. Right. So George Bush, right, had deported more people than any other president before, then Obama, and then we'll see. So I really want to make that a point to sort of say, like, again, Alan's right. The laws have not changed. Only the priorities have changed moving forward. And I can't speak too much to the citizenship aspect to things, right? I think what the community is more concerned about is getting detained and deported and looking at those laws, right? Particularly the expansion of the criminal categories that had happened that make someone deportable, looking at the retroactive nature, right? So folks that have committed, folks that have gone through the system, right, in the 80s and 90s, and even in the 70s or 60s, are now completely at risk. So really stripping away a lot of the harmful effects that the 1996 laws had basically, has wreaked havoc and separated a lot of families. And speaking around the sort of the volume, right? I think that, we're in a dangerous place in which we say, well, can you deport, more than 500,000 a year, right? We're looking at an apparatus that continues to grow. And so I would say that, the question really shouldn't be, is it possible or is it realistic financially, right? The question should be, like, do we really want this system in place? Is this a system for a democratic society?
All right, gentlemen, it's been a really good conversation. We've talked about sanctuary cities. We've talked about a little bit about everything. I really want to thank you both for coming in.
You.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thanks again to my guest, Alan Wernick, the director of CUNY Citizenship Now, and Abraham Paulus, the executive director of the human rights organization Families for Freedom. That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.